Alright guys, for those of you who know me, my name is Giuseppe, and I wanted to do a video review of Final Fantasy IX because I looked at my the little review I wrote, and I wasn't satisfied by it because there's a lot of things that were missing and not included, and I thought that by doing a video, it was easier to talk about more things and to be more fleshed out, so this is what I wanted to do. So let's first do the background of Final Fantasy IX. The game came out in 2000, and one of the reasons why it didn't sell as well as 7 or 8 was because around that time the PlayStation 2 came out, and everybody was anticipating the release of Final Fantasy X, which in a lot of ways was sort of overshadowing 9 because of the voice acting, the newer graphics, and things like that. So in terms of sales, it didn't do as good as the previous two. But nevertheless, this was my favorite in the series for a lot of reasons. So one of the biggest things behind the reason why 9 was created was because it was a send-off to the previous 8 entries. Now, when I first played 9, okay, I didn't get all the hints and the nods towards the other games because before then, being, kind of young, I only played 7 and 8 before, so I only got some of the hints. But when I went back to play 1 through 6, I was able to understand a lot of the things they were referencing, which is what I liked. As well as Sakaguchi said that this was his favorite in the series as well, because it was his true vision of what Final Fantasy should be. And I have to agree because while 7 and 8 were more sci-fi, futuristic, with more realistic character models, this was more fantasy. And I'm sorry, I'm trying to think since this is on the fly. 9 was definitely more fantasy oriented than the previous two because, for one, it was the art design, which I'll get into that a little bit later. But first, let's talk about the gameplay. Now, the gameplay was pretty much similar to what the previous 8 were. It was obviously because they had the ATB, you had turn-based battles, but this time, like in the older games, you could use 4 characters only instead of 3, which I thought was good, as well as having characters who are locked into their classes, unlike the other games where you could choose each character's class and for however you want. If you wanted to have a monk and things like that, you could choose it in the older games, but the characters were locked in. But they also had their all unique skills, which is what I'm going to get into now. The way you learn abilities in this game is that you learn them from equipment, obviously equipping them, like armor, hats, helmets, the weapons themselves, arm gear, body gear, and then you had the accessories. A lot of abilities between each of the characters, a lot of them were the same. To protect things against status, you had things like auto life, auto reflect, auto haste, which was shared with all the characters together, but each character also had their individual sets of abilities. For example, since Zidane was the thief, he had abilities like Bandit and Master Thief, which helps you steal a lot easier than if you're not using it. Well, got people while characters like Vivi had more abilities that was more dedicated to magic, like all the reflect abilities and return magic and stuff like that, which I thought was good because it was probably the easiest way to learn abilities. For example, you had in 7, you had materia, which were like how many million combinations you can do. And in 8, where junctioning, well, it was good to be able to junction individual stats for each character. However, acquiring the spells, the drawing was extremely tedious. And in order to actually be able to control each, I guess you could say it, to junction each trait, you had to be able to unlock it using your GF, which does take a long time, especially for the GFs later in the game, which by themselves took a while to even get. So you couldn't even do of all the statuses until basically towards the end of the game. Also, what was good about this was the ability to synthesize new items, which brings me into my next point. Unlike 8, Gil was a lot more important in this game than it was in 8. Like in 8, you had your seed rank, and you would get paid for how many steps you take, and then you get paid. The problem was there's only so much you could buy with the Gil in 8. For example, there was no armor really. You can sort of synthesize new weapons, but you would have to actually have all the items to do it, and it even wasn't that expensive to begin with. In 9, it was good idea. It was a good idea to acquire a lot of Gil because all the equipment, the majority of the equipment you're going to be getting is by buying it, and to get even newer and better equipment, it gave you a reason to save all your old equipment and not to sell them, to be able to synthesize it into better items. Also was the auction house. Now the auction house was pretty basic. You go to the auction house to buy really good equipment, but a lot of times it required a lot of Gil. And for those of you who know the cotton rope trick, really helps out, especially earlier in the game, to get all the equipment you need. This brings me into my next point, which was more or less the melee characters like Zidane, Freya, Amarant, Kina. Really was what I thought was really good is that they all had their own unique ability. That the damage from that ability is dependent upon other factors. For example, one of the best reasons to steal in the game was because not only to get really good equipment, was because every successful steal, as well as your speed, evasion, helps him bump up the damage of thievery, which is very easy to max out really early on, as long as you just keep successfully stealing and have a high speed stat as well as evade. And this was also the same for Freya, but Freya's Dragon Crest was more dependent on how many dragons you've killed in the game, which equals the number of what your damage is. And this is also the same for Kina, because the amount of frogs you catch during frog catching is also dependent upon the damage he's going to be able to do. Frog catching was a little more annoying because of the spawn rate, but I always did it because of the fact that you could do max damage with him, especially late on in the game. Now, one of the biggest complaints, I guess, about the game's mechanics was the battle speed, which was a lot slower than other games. It didn't really bother me that much, but some people, they found it annoying to the point where they didn't like the game because of it, which I thought is kind of stupid. But all you gotta do, really, is just up the battle speed and configuration. So, another kind of complaint about people, and I've noticed this too, and this is really part of all Final Fantasy games, is the blue magic. A lot of blue magic, I've noticed, like a lot of people have probably noticed as well, that a lot of it is pretty useless. Okay? In 9, you had some decent abilities of blue magic. For example, you had Mighty Guard, you had Magic Hammer, which Magic Hammer is probably the best one because it can drain all of your enemies' MP if you use it. The problem is that a lot of it is based too much on like math equations rather than just straight up being effective. In 9, to get blue magic, like in well, this really wasn't done in a lot of other games, but Kina has to eat a certain enemy to gain an ability, which at times, yeah, was a major pain in the ass, and you know why. Mainly because the HP of the enemy has to be at a quarter full, which sometimes you may accidentally kill an enemy trying to get an ability from because of this. His trance ability, Cook, did it at 50%, which wasn't bad, but that's my next complaint was Trance. Trance was basically Limit Break's version of N9. And the reason why Trance wasn't that good was because it was, number one, it was unpredictable. Number two, if you're at the end of a battle, and for example, you get hit and you go into trance and you already killed the enemy, you basically just wasted it. It's not like, well, if you get into trance like a Limit Break in 7, where you can save it for the next battle and use it then. If you get into trance by the time the end of the battle, you basically wasted it. The concept for it, I think, was pretty good because it did have something to do with the storyline. Obviously, for those of you who played it, the problem was the execution. The execution just was not well done at all. But Trance, in some ways was very useful. For example, Zidane's trance was when Zidane goes into trance, and the way he learns new trance was the abilities on his weapons that you obviously learned throughout the game by equipping the different weapons. So when Zidane tranced and he uses one of his trances, it's like an increase of damage by a certain percentage. I think it goes up to maybe 300 or 400% of normal damage. I think. Don't quote me on that. And